Something just killed my dog.
Something killed your dog?
My dog went flying through the air over the tree. I don't know how it did it.
Okay.
Back in the 60s and 70s, there was a notion, a paradigm that was central to anthropology. The idea that there could be only one hominin species occupying an exclusive hominin niche. The sort of ecological principle that no two species can occupy the same niche was incorporated into the fabric of anthropology and influenced the way the fossil record was viewed. And so human evolution was seen as this single file march, this very singular procession of one species giving rise to another and being succeeded by it, and so on down the pike. We now know, however, that rather than this single file march, there was this bushy tree, this diversity of hominins that existed across the landscape at any given slice of time in the past, and that many of those branches on this bushy tree have persisted alongside our own lineage until much more recently than had ever been acknowledged. One of the things it's so fascinating about this topic, that it actually has anticipated our current understanding of the pattern and process of human evolution, which itself has gone through an evolution of sorts. So this raises an interesting question. In light of the persistent reports of wildmen, of non-human wildmen around the world, whether it's Sasquatch or the Yeti or the Yeren or the Almas or the Orang Pendek, I mean the names, the list of names is longer than my arm. In light of our growing understanding of the tremendous diversity of hominin evolution, the adaptive radiation, and the very possible, very probable survival of relic populations of some of these lineages, it's quite fascinating that the footprints line up with several of those possibilities. So for example, we've got Sasquatch, this giant form, which has a foot that's remarkably elegantly adapted to such a creature, a large, heavy creature walking bipedally on flat feet. We have the Russian Almas, which could very likely be a relic Neanderthal or maybe Denisovan. Its footprints, its sightings occur in areas where we also have the fossil remains of Neanderthals in the most remote corners of its former range across Europe and Western Asia. It's a much closer relative to us. Therefore, it has a foot that more resembles ours. It has an arch. It's a low arch, but it's a very broad, stout foot with splayed toes that suggest it has not, confined its feet in shoe wear as we often do. Over here, we've got the best evidence, in my opinion, of the Yeti, or the abominable snowman, as it's popularly known. It basically looks like a chunky chimpanzee with shorter, stout digits, but a divergent big toe. In this case, it's sort of aligned with the other toes, but I think that's just because it was walking through a snowfield. But clearly has the capability of prehensile grip. It was probably, or is probably, an arboreal species, one that spends a great deal of time in trees, foraging for food and seeking shelter. The Yeren, as it is called, translates to wild man, and it's remarkably similar in the description of its stature, its covering with hair, its behaviors. The only thing that contrasts really is the slightly more frequent description of a reddish-brown color to that hair. whereas in North America, brown to dark brown or black seems to be the most common color phase described by eyewitnesses. But in many respects, it's remarkably similar. This came home all the more profoundly when I had the opportunity to visit with some investigators, a witness in China, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Yuan, who had seen a Yeren while working as a ranger in the Shenanjia Nature Reserve in Hubei province in central China, located in the highlands of central China. He described something that was absolutely parallel to witness descriptions of the Sasquatch, and on top of that he found a set of tracks and successfully cast a right and a left footprint. Now, what was so remarkable about this was that upon examining those tracks, which I had the privilege of doing firsthand, we discovered that they were remarkably similar, almost identical in many respects, to those of the Sasquatch. In particular, a very distinctive specimen that has played a key role in my interpretation of the model of the functional morphology of the foot of the Sasquatch and how it's distinguished from a typical human foot and footprint. In fact, I had given Mr. Yuan a reprint of an article in which I had described some of these adaptations and had illustrated a 3D scan of this cast made by Bob Titmus at the Patterson-Gimlin film site, no less, in Northern California in 1967. Mr. Yuan became very excited and animated when he looked at these figures, and it became very apparent why when he unveiled from his little suitcase his specimens. And you can see here as they're compared, they show this remarkable pressure ridge, this mid-tarsal pressure ridge. They even show with a little more distinction, I think partly due to the breadth and perhaps larger mass of this individual, this feature here, this sort of double-arched feature, which, not to be confused with the arch of a foot, but just these two prominences which indicate the presence of the key joints in the midfoot, the talonavicular and the calcaneocuboid joint.
Can those be found in the human foot?
They can. These are joints that are present in the human foot, in all mammals for that matter, and they comprise what we call together the transverse tarsal joint, which in a human twists into a closed, packed, very stable position and creates a rigid arch. But in the Sasquatch and in other non-human primates who retain a much greater degree of flexibility, the heel moves somewhat independently of the forefoot. So when a Sasquatch walks, as you can see illustrated here, this is my interpretation of this particular feature of the Sasquatch footprint. Whereas the human, with its rigid arch, as the heel elevates, the entire foot acts as a lever with the fulcrum located here at the ball, particularly of the big toe. The Sasquatch, on the other hand, its heel elevates while weight is transferred still through the entire forefoot due to the ability to flex here at the transverse tarsal joint. And here, sometimes weight will push some material up into the now vacant heel impression and create this pressure ridge in the footprint itself. I was the first to draw attention to this feature, the first to offer an interpretation that was consistent with the comparative anatomy of great apes and humans. And, but that wasn't published until the late 90s. And yet here we have a set of footprints cast by someone who has no training in anatomy and functional morphology or the evolutionary history of the human and non-human 8 foot, and yet in the early 90s, almost a decade before I had published, he presents evidence or collects evidence that that incorporates this very morphology. I mean, talk about not only does this reiterate the interpretation that I've proposed, but it so dramatically, in my mind, demonstrates the legitimacy of this specimen due to its remarkable consistency and the presence of a similar creature in Asia, in China here specifically, which, once you get north through Siberia, is close at hand to the mountainous forests of the Pacific Northwest. For example, I have a specimen that was collected in the Caucasus Mountains, the North Caucasus, and witnessed by literally the entire village. A long line of tracks, of which a right and a left were cast and were curated by a museum director there in the village, and who was kind enough to share these with us. For all intents and purposes, these look remarkably like a Sasquatch track. Here's an example of one. You can see the remarkable breadth, the splay, the mobility of the toes that are so characteristic of the Sasquatch track. Its flat-footedness, the lack of a longitudinal arch, evidence of a greater degree of midfoot flexibility, all which seem to be adaptations of a very large, heavy biped for negotiating very uneven, steep, mountainous terrain. Well, in a small village in the North Caucasus, there was a disturbance, a sighting by a handful of villagers of this giant, hairy, man-like creature that made its way through town, and in the process left hundreds, if not thousands, of extremely clear footprints in the fresh snow and mud. These were witnessed by virtually the entire village, and one of the local gentlemen made very successfully a pair of footprint casts documenting this sighting. I was able to visit with a couple of those villagers. One in particular is a very experienced outdoorsman, a naturalist who is a professional guide, as well as a parliamentarian in their government. So a very intelligent man who, with whom we compared notes and photographs of Sasquatch tracks, and he was very cognizant of the distinctions between a human footprint and what we were seeing. I mean, not only in size, but in the functional morphology. This, the local designation of this creature is the Dev, short for the devil. And it's remarkably similar to early accounts of Sasquatch. Before the word Sasquatch and Bigfoot became common, these were mountain devils. They were equated with demons and goblins and devils. And so it's remarkably convergent in that respect as well. Its description and its behaviors, its lack of material culture, tools, clothing, fire, etc., all remarkably parallel the descriptions and the profile that emerges from all of these encounters and descriptions of eyewitnesses for the Sasquatch. And so, yet clearly of independent origin as far as the understanding of these creatures. But I think they certainly share a common source, a common ancestor, if you will, And if they constitute separate species, that's very possible given the duration of separation and distinction between the two. So excellent evidence, in my opinion, that there is continuity between Asia and North America in the distribution of this particular species. Like I said, so many other species of mammal which we take for granted as being native to North America actually had their origins in Asia and have extended their range at various times into North America. Well, I was invited not too long ago to examine an interesting site that was discovered up here on the Olympic Peninsula on the Puget Sound side. There was a timber cruiser who was marking out some stands of timber for harvest and stumbled upon a remarkable find. He was an experienced outdoorsman, had spent many, many years in the field, and this was unlike anything he had seen. It was a collection, a series of beds, nests, if you will. And these bore remarkable resemblance to the ground nests made by gorillas in Africa. Now, bears do make nests, but they essentially scrape material from the forest floor, the duff or bark from a tree. This, however, these examples of nests had a much more complicated structure. We actually took one of the nests and we literally cut right down through a pie wedge and examined the stratigraphy of how they were constructed, taking that bit apart and collecting all the materials. There was an undercarriage of sticks, fairly good-sized sticks, broom handle-sized sticks, that created a sort of a platform upon which more material was piled. And then the nests were located behind an immense stand of evergreen huckleberries, and these bushes stand a good 7-8 feet tall, and the top spriggers had been snapped off, had pinched off, and those green boughs not piled but woven into the surface of this nest in such a way that it had a raised lip and a depressed center area, and or they, not just it, because there were 5 or 6 of them. And it was quite fascinating. By the time I had seen them, the leaves had dropped, so it even had more the appearance of a bird nest than previously. We took core samples from the center of these nests upon examining them, and of the material that they were comprised of, and that was frozen and sent to Dr. Todd Disotell at NYU, New York University, for analysis by methods of environmental DNA analysis. The results were not entirely satisfying. He did detect a primate DNA sample, but concluded that on the basis of the sequence it was human, which means it was either by way of contamination or whatever else, just contamination of handling the specimens, although we went to great lengths to make sure that we did not ourselves contaminate the samples that we were collecting. This raised a serious question in my mind, and that was, did we have sufficient DNA sequence in order to conclusively determine that this was or was not a human? The question has to be acknowledged, or the fact has to be acknowledged, that if these creatures exist, they're going to be extremely closely related to us. Chimps differ by just a few percentage points in their DNA sequence, which means you have to sequence a fair amount of DNA or know specifically where there are distinctions to be identified. I've raised this question with other geneticists You know, is a few thousand base pairs sufficient? And the consensus has been, no, we should sequence the entire mitochondrial genome and at least a dozen nuclear genes to boot. Of course, that's a lot more labor intensive and expensive to carry out that analysis, but that's what it's going to take to make sure that we find on these parallel sequences enough distinguishing characteristics to know that it is or is not a human sample that we're dealing with.